Hey everyone, we are excited to launch the Bright Mind subscription. Unlimited access to all of our CE courses, webinars, and expert speakers all in one place.
And for a limited time for the month of December, you can get 50% off. Normally $299 a year, now just $149 for your first year.
That's unlimited CE on your schedule for half price.
Head over to psych2practice.com and click sign up, and the discount is already applied. We look forward to seeing you there. And as always, be well, stay psyched. This episode of the Psych to Practice podcast is sponsored by PAR, where psychological assessments meet innovation.
PAR has been the gold standard in the industry for over 45 years and has empowered professionals in education, healthcare, private practice, and research with trusted tools and cutting-edge solutions.
Discover more at parinc.com. Again, that is parinc.com. Creating connections, changing lives. Hello and welcome to the Psych to Practice podcast, your one-stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insights from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm your host, Paul Wagner, and joining me as always,
Ray Christner.
And, kind of a bit of a revisit to a general topic, but wanting to really get a bit more specific here. If you've been a longtime fan of the show, you know that we have the, our now condensed words episode, but kind of stemming from words matter, swear words really matter, and it's not the words that matter the most. And wanting to kind of add a little bit to that and getting a bit more specific here for today.
Yeah, and I think maybe moving in a little bit of a clinical direction from where our other episodes were. And, really, I think two pieces that I think I want to cover tonight. And one is this kind of growing tendency to an idea that I don't know if this is the technical term, but this idea of language inflation. So where we hear people using either clinical or extreme terms, things like being a hostage or abuse or trauma or narcissist or whatever, but using them in a way that we're just describing just everyday experiences and kind of the impact. And then kind of a pendulum swing. And on the other end, really want to talk about clinician language and talking about kind of a move where I'm starting to see and seeing some ramifications of the avoidance of using difficult clinical language in reports and notes. And really, while I think important to talk about strength-based approaches, doing them in a way where avoiding using words that might be necessary to create medical necessity or to get services. And so I want to talk about maybe both ends of that today.
Yeah. And, maybe starting in this first idea of the really strong, overly evocative language. And actually, as we're getting ready, you kind of shared a little bit of what one of the reasons why this episode came into being. And do you mind kind of sharing a little bit of that story so we can kind of use it maybe?
Yeah. So this has kind of come up a lot. But what really kind of prompted me, I think two things in 24 hours kind of happened, but the one that really got me on this inflation was somebody I see for therapy who came in and was quite heightened, definitely angry, some anxiety that was going on. And it was all over a situation at work. And the wording that they used was that their boss held them hostage the night before. And then there's a lot of other language that went in there that, it was torture. It was, very kind of heavy words. And, one of the things that in that was the more the language got big, the more the emotions got intense and deep and almost, for lack of a better word, kind of a cognitive spiral that was happening. And it, and so part of the intervention for me that night was kind of getting in there and I'm going to use the word challenge, but really kind of addressing the language and kind of going let's kind of talk about what that means, those wording. And what was real interesting was the more we kind of went through it, I saw this real calming that kind of happened. And it made me think when we hear people use this language inflation, if we're not therapeutically challenging it, and that continues to be the way they describe situations, are we doing a disservice in not addressing it? And I think we have to do it in a very kind of cautious way, because I think it could feel being dismissed as well. But yes, I mean that was really the main piece, and kind of working through that situation. And then it was interesting. Like after I was like, wow, we should do it. We should kind of focus this as an episode. I started going through and just looking at language. Some of the ones that I had was people saying, this meeting at work traumatized me today. And I hate meetings in general, but again, big language. My parents abused me because they grounded me. My teacher's response gave me PTSD. Even things like, oh, I'm so OCD, where we're really using a diagnosis to describe a behavior. And in this case, the person said that mainly because they were cleaning up after themselves. I wish I did more of that some days. Or the other one I came up with was everyone in my life is a narcissist, was another one. So yeah, I don't know. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes up. I mean, not even just in session, but I want that to be the focus. But I think it's prevalent everywhere. And the one, I guess, maybe deviation from session I want to talk about is I'm a part of a decent number of online groups surrounding mental health topics. And some of them are on the clinician side, some of it on the diagnostic side. And I think more of if it's a support group, I hear a lot of really charged language. And so even if this idea of, if we're doing a narrative storytelling in a way, how all of a sudden, sharing that and then someone chimes in with that idea of I don't know how you can put up with that. I would never go back there. Or, that's criminal how they treated you. And
right.
And, I think, in attempts to validate, we inflate sometimes it becomes, a bit of a soapbox. And I think those platforms can be wonderful, but I think that they can also they can really charge experiences that might not be as beneficial or might not warrant it in a way. And I think, clinicians at times, I'm speaking personally, I know I've been in a position where I have to catch myself to not validate some of those experiences and, not kind of saying that sounds awful. Whoa, before I kind of, if I were to say, yeah, that sounds awful. And even if I'm trying to soften, are they walking out of there, and saying yeah, my therapist told me that I was
right,
held hostage, and how awful that was, versus if we're not addressing it directly in a way. And so I do think it's something of having to be mindful and intentional with, but also it's not something we just want to I'm just going to mirror the language, but sometimes mirroring is not just enough, but we actually have to be a bit more direct with it.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. I guess I wasn't even thinking about the way we may unintentionally reinforce that language. And again, I think it's a balance. I've done a lot of kind of reflecting on why do people go that route? Why do they use that language? I try not to talk like that. I do sometimes. But some things one is I think social media has contributed because there's a lot of sound bites that use that language, people who I think are influencers who are trying to get dramatic effect. That's what they do. But then it puts it in our vernacular, right? It puts it in our everyday language. We've heard it so many times. But then when we say, I was held hostage, we're not really thinking about what that means. It becomes, I think, reflexive.
Yeah.
We hear it so much.
And the thought that as you were sharing it, even just this most recent time, it's almost an incomplete simile or metaphor, where
right.
we're missing the use of it as a comparison tool versus it being, we're making a declarative statement of what the experience was. And so if it's right. I was locked in, it was almost like I had OCD in this moment. Still not crazy about it, but now we're using it as a circumstantial moment versus, an attribute that we're assigning to ourselves of, my OCD. It's the difference there. And even the hostage, and last night I felt like I was held hostage. Right. I know it wasn't, but there was a difference there versus, again, similarly or as elements of that comparatively to a declarative statement in that sense.
Oh, I think that I mean, I think that matters so much. I mean, I think that you know, I think I probably have said at some point in my life, wow, I really felt like a hostage in that situation. I think that, that's, we hear that kind of language in some level. I do think that you're right. I think that saying it in a way that it describes the elevation of the experience, making kind of a metaphor of sorts, is much different than I was held hostage. Like I think our brain, well, I know our brain processes it differently. Like it just does. And that's where I think understanding this means so much, because our brains are designed to process that language. And it just elevates. And then what does that do to us emotionally?
Yeah. And I'm almost thinking of it as like it's not the accurate usage of it, but like, the functional attribution error in a way of, sure. We're creating this attribution statement or declarative statement versus it being, circumstantial, and trying to just build awareness of the impact of the circumstance. And so, but instead of circumstance, it's comparison in a sense. And so how easy it is to fall into those, it makes a good story, and whether or if we're emulating what we hear, or it's just, our vernacular has changed and it's adding some of this in. But also I think as much as we're adding in concepts, we're shortening down how we disperse it. I can think about short form content.
Yeah.
And so how do I capture this experience? I was held hostage.
Right.
I don't need to elaborate on, there's a lot that needs elaborated, but I get my message across in that.
Right.
Not thinking about how we sit with it in our interpretation experience, especially when we ruminate on it.
And now a word from our sponsor. PAR's AI Report Writer is an AI-boosted tool that generates comprehensive reports, including interpretations and recommendations based on scores from a wide range of popular assessment tools. Spend less time on report writing and more time supporting students. Learn more at parinc.com/AI. That is parinc.com/AI. And now back to our conversation. Yeah, and I mean, even to the extent when we use those kind of that language, like, and how does it impact us wanting to, like in that situation, to go back to work the next day?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's, if that's what I felt, that's going to create a whole other emotional experience. And in this case, it did that for that individual. Yeah. So I think there's like the social media piece. I like that you mentioned that kind of the error kind of in thinking, because I looked at it as kind of an emotional reasoning, like we're really, or maybe a desire for validation. Mm-hmm. We want people to know how tough it was for us. And I think that's okay. Like, I mean, I think there's a better way to do it. And, and again, I think it's also, we see this idea that therapeutic language just enters this every day. And that's not a new issue. I mean, it's interesting. I'm doing this presentation on intellectual disabilities. And one of the things that I'm doing with it is researching the history of diagnosis. And, the fact that, imbecile and idiot were the clinical diagnoses of the time. Now, today we use them very different. And the reason those diagnosis names changed was because people started using them in everyday language as insults. And then, doesn't sound better, but we went to moron as the next kind of term. And then we use terms like mental retardation. And, now we see that's kind of gone. But that's the danger, I think, of what we do. Something that was clinical. And it's interesting. I want to give a history lesson today, but I could get into it. But like the whole idea of idiot and imbecile, which even when I say them out loud, I kind of go, oh, that's a little cringe to doing that, because that's, where I'm at in kind of my life. But when you read why they chose those terms and the real clinical reason, it was actually quite smart and maybe even a little elegant, for a lack of a better word. But we bastardize terms by how we use them. And I see that happening now with so many things. You know, I can't tell you how many times in a week that somebody uses tism, which drives me insane. Like I get a reaction out of that. So yeah, I just think that it can go kind of all over the place. So I guess when we hear this, before we kind of go to the second phase of this, I guess how do you respond? Like, so I kind of have my approach now that I use when I hear extreme language, and it's similar to what I even do with people in my life who use extreme language. But like, so if you have somebody that comes in and they use some of these charged kind of words, what's your approach?
That depends.
Yeah,
but I would say oftentimes where I hear the language coming the most, and a lot of my clients will hear me kind of, I kind of, one of the consistent things is I try to define my role. Like before, I'm like, hey, I'm here to challenge you, or I'm here to like, give it my perspective, or shifting this thought, whatever that may be. But it's just kind of an acknowledgement of like, hey, I'm going to push, and to the point where a lot of my clients are like, I know I'm ready. I know I'm ready. Here we go. Like it can almost kind of be a dialogue sure. back and forth. But even that action, I think, helps prime them for, all right, I'm going to be challenged, and either I need to feel strongly enough to defend myself and defend why this is accurate, or I want to be open to hearing kind of what my insight or what my take is there. And I think a lot of times I look for patterns that present themselves in our session. So that was an absolute statement. I was like, is there a way you can bring that back, and we're just make it conditional? And so if it's like, she's never going to understand. Hey, I'm going to challenge you. All right. Like, that's absolute. Is there a difference? And so like being able to kind of building awareness. And I think through that, like, that's just a bit of the rapport that I build, but oftentimes working to catch some of those really intense statements. Now, as far like, I'm sure it has, but I can't think of any recent time when like that, I've been held hostage, or
that's
for sure.
Yeah.
But, I have had that, like, if this doesn't work out, I guess there's always the option off in my own, like, whoa.
Right.
And like, so like, even like I can use
straight
kind of a calling out, and not, I want to almost say like with a bit of a humor element to it, but I'm like, whoa, hey, where are you at right now? And they're like, okay, and then it's like, okay, like, well, what do you mean? Like, and like, we can kind of get into those types of conversations where I'm asking for elaboration, and I'm asking for them to kind of stop and like, not just use the intense short language, but rather clarify it for me. And we don't need to you don't need to write me a novel, but leave me understanding with clarity what it means. And that's where then I also like the active listening element of reflecting back on my own way. I'm like, all right, does this sound right? And I'll kind of give that. Yeah, that's about right. And oftentimes, but it is that it's not just a validation through, back to your comment of like, I was held hostage. And if I was like, that sounds awful. Like it's not a validation. It's a reflection and a reframing of what I'm hearing in that way. So I would say those are some of the ways that I find myself doing it. And it is, and it's not trying to downplay and trying to say, hey, you're overreacting. Like right. That's sure. That's
right.
Probably
not the right way. Yeah.
So I want it to be activating enough, but I also want it to feel like what we're talking about still is functional, and we have direction we can move from it, versus it just being an intense statement that just kind of is an anchor that pulls them down and keeps them stuck in a situation or moment. We're not really able to move on from it.
Yeah. It's, I kind of use the simple phrase in my head is this idea of don't correct, but explore.
Yeah.
Is kind of really my summary of it when I kind of deal with it. And like, so, I mean, I guess using the example I gave, my response, I tend to say kind of the same things over and over, I think, but I kind of said, when that came up, I went, wow, like this situation has you using some big words, not big words like long words, but like big words like, wow, this was really tough. tell me about like let's talk about that experience. Like I'm just curious about that piece of it. Can we kind of talk through what makes those words right? And then of course kind of listening and then moving into kind of like, okay, so like I get it. This sucked. This was a terrible situation. Can we try different words to see how that impacts? And like I'm just curious, like when I hear hostage, in my mind, it brings up bad news clips. It brings up like there's a lot of things when I hear that word. And so I'm just curious, like how that reacts with you. And so, we basically, long story short, was like, kind of going through and just, hitting on different ways. And yeah, I think we kind of landed somewhere on, man, my boss was a real asshole. And he was disrespectful for not giving me a heads up and telling me I had to stay. And why there was that reaction was I had other things I wanted to do. And I respect my job enough not to walk out. Because at the end of the day, and I think we landed in somewhere of like, as a hostage, yeah, I probably could never leave. I did have the choice to walk out. Now, there was a consequence to that choice. But as I'm kind of giving the Reader's Digest version of an hour conversation, but essentially we work through it to come up with some alternate language. And then I said, like, when you say it now, when you say it in that way, what's the emotion? And she's like, yeah, I'm still pissed off. Like it just shouldn't have happened. I'm like, hey, but we can do something with pissed off. Like we can do like, what do you think you should do? Like, I think, it wouldn't be inappropriate to talk to human resources at your job that if somebody called off 4 hours earlier, you shouldn't have had a 5-minute notice that you need to stay an extra 2 hours. Like that is disrespectful. Like we're good with that. So that's kind of how I go through it. I look at it as I'll use things like, wow, those are big words. Like let's talk through. What's that word mean to you? Those kind of questions and reframing. So my goal is not to correct. Like I wouldn't say, well, you weren't a hostage, or that's not being traumatized. Like I think I have had people say, yeah, I've had people tell me that. It gets us nowhere. It just creates a defense. I think so. This explore, I think, is important kind of to me.
And one more piece, like not every circumstance, but I think a lot of them, when it is a bit of that experience where someone's describing something, I oftentimes, I think, also try to then talk about, does the intensity, like when you're saying like you could walk out, there's a consequence, but you could, it's kind of that, what's the moment after? Right. Like, so we're stuck in that moment of like, I'm being told this, and it's just like, I can like really just stay in that, like, this is messed up. I didn't have a choice. It's like, what's the moment after that? What's the opportunity or what's the circumstance? And even if it's, I'm thinking of like some anxiety, like, no, I can't do that. No way I could do that. Like I'd lose my mind, whatever. I can't think of a direct example, but it's like eventually we wouldn't feel that stressed. Like we would if we would, you'd be laying in bed that night and it might've been awful, like terrible. Like it just did not go any way or shape, form you wanted it to. But at the end of the night, you're laying in bed. And it's like we can recover, we can heal, like we can be resilient. So it is also not trying to be dismissive, but I think also trying to make it making that moment where it becomes stuck a bit more. I think the word I'm looking for is transitory in a way. Like we can go back to prior, what happened before. We can then digest that moment, but then we need to be able to move forward from it and not just stay stuck, because I think that's where. That's not functional. That's not helping us out in the moment. It's just making us resentful of someone we're going to have to work with, ongoing until we decide to make a change.
Yeah. And I think that, at the end of the day, our goal is, it really isn't to minimize the person's reaction or kind of suffering, for lack of a better word. But our goal is to help the person describe that suffering or reaction more accurate. Yeah. And I think that's like, and that's always the piece. It's not to say, listen, what happened to this individual? I would have been mad. Like, I mean, I would have been pretty angry myself. I don't want to minimize, but getting to a point where they could process the information and do something with that. Where when it was heightened hostage language, we couldn't get anywhere. It was it was this cognitive cyclone that was just not, she couldn't get out of. And when we reframed it, then we made progress. Then we had solutions. We had some options while still validating the emotion. And I think that it is the balance we do have to kind of continue.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the second one. And this one's maybe a little, I don't know if it's trickier, but so my 24-hour period, I had one situation of that we just talked about. And the second was I did an evaluation on someone who essentially lost all of their benefits. So insurance, Social Security, disability, because they were audited and records that were requested, the notes that the therapist had written and the reports that were written in a very strength-based approach, which I'm not discounting as a good thing in some ways, but it was written in such a way that the audit found that the person didn't have a functional impairment that would require that level of support. And I will tell you, when I saw them for the evaluation, that is not the case. This is an individual who has definitely some things that are impacting their ability to be able to work and other things. And so it got me again kind of thinking about, the words that we use clinically. And, this idea of pendulum swing, I think historically, mental health has done a lot of disservice. And, we really had this very deficit-based mindset with mental health for so many years. And I'm glad, and I see in my 30 years, I've seen such a great change from that. But I think my concern and why I wanted to bring this up is I think we've moved in some ways so far on the other end that there are ramifications that can happen. So it's interesting. The day I had this case was the same day that the Supreme Court ruled on a death penalty case for an individual with an intellectual disability that they were going to execute. And part of the reason that it went clear to the Supreme Court was the language that was used. I mean, our words could have life or death consequences, right?
Yeah.
So that's where it kind of got me thinking. So
wow.
Yeah, it was interesting. So, I mean, I think clinically we have this intention of kindness, and we should, and I think we should do that. But I don't think we should go so far that there's a consequence where we may reduce a person's ability for support or things of that nature. And again, my head started going all over. Like, I was like, wow, what if this clinician gets audited? Could an insurance company say, wow, your notes don't reflect that there's medical necessity? And, so I don't know, thoughts that you have.
And I think one of the initial thoughts, and it's more so, I guess, in what I hear pop culture wise, is this the sayings of like, everyone needs therapy or everyone could benefit from therapy. I don't think I necessarily disagree with that, but if we're looking at what's the way in which, the majority of individuals access therapy through insurance, then we need to have that identified impairment. We need to have that medical necessity. We need to justify the reasoning for the services that are there. And really, I'm going to pick on BetterHelp for a moment, just because they're in a lot of my podcast shirts. And just like hearing the stories and the descriptions that, the individuals I'm listening to, as entertainers, and usually I believe that there's an element of like a personal note to it. That from them, like they'll mention it in other contexts that they're in therapy, but they talk about like, if it's like, oh, we went over this and like, this is why every listener, could really benefit. And I do think there's this social, like there's pop culture-ish element of like, therapy is like a haircut. Everyone could benefit from a haircut. You're looking sure, you're just kind of refining, like, you're just refining areas. And like, well, I'd love that. That's not necessarily the system we're in.
Yeah.
And I think that can get conflated at times. And so when you're describing that, like especially the strength-based piece, like there's elements of like, it sounds very much like I want the people I'm working with to feel good, but I'm probably not accurately representing them in a way.
Right.
And I go back to even my statement earlier of how we as clinicians can potentially reinforce certain things. And even if we are in the session using language of like, if we're not acknowledging issues or concerns, and actually, before we started this, Ray, you took like 3 times, I think, for me to really comprehend the question fully. But, ultimately it was kind of this like, would I get offended, if talking about ADHD and talking about it as an impairment and talking about the deficits that, it creates and the impact? And I think my response was like, I think like, and it was very accurate, very well framed. Like, I don't know that does it, justice, but like, I want to lean more into it rather than less. And like that softness of like, oh, hey, they have a hard time with focus.
Yeah.
And everyone can have a hard time with focus. If it's, we see an impairment where they're not able to complete this or where they're struggling to complete it on time and consistently missing due dates to the point where they're potentially losing their job.
Right.
All right. Hey, like that is something that we can really kind of identify and making it, what are we looking to change? If struggling with focus, is that really going to be it versus I don't want you to lose your job because of this impairment.
Right.
And being able to differentiate there.
Right. And I think that, we've moved to the point that identifying that we all have deficits or challenges or impairments as a bad thing. And I think this is where the neurodivergence movement has been brilliant, is that it is okay that we have these differences, but these differences can be severe, and that's okay. It doesn't discount the strengths that someone has. And I still think we need to really talk about those strengths with people, but how we discuss it, it does have kind of implications. And, going back to your kind of better help kind of thing, I think it's interesting. I've been lately reading research on iatrogenesis, this idea that, we don't like to talk about it, but our interventions that we do can be harmful to some people. That, we as clinicians want to believe that we help everybody, but there is a percentage of people in therapy that get worse. So I don't know that everybody needs therapy is an accurate statement. I think therapy is wonderful for a lot of people, but for some people it's not. And being able to recognize that will make us better clinicians. I have had people that I've seen for therapy and they didn't get better. And I kind of said, I think you coming here is actually making it so much in your presence that it's not helping. And I tell everybody that I see, kind of part of my disclosure is, yes, there's a possibility that there is a side effect. Like when I hear therapists say there's no side effect to therapy, no, there is. Like research has shown it. There's also great benefit, but we do need to talk about both sides of those coins. But yeah, so back to the wording. I think we have to avoid stigmatizing. I think that's important. I think, watching in a way where if we're writing a note and everything is negative, that's not we shouldn't be doing that either. We really don't need to use pathologizing language, but we do need to talk in a functional way. So, eligibility decisions for insurance reimbursement, for certain services, for special education in school, they're based on terms like functional impairment, educational impact, disability related needs. Like these are the terms that legally we look at. Limitations in major life activities, I think, is one. So, for me, I think we have to talk about strengths. I'm not trying to get away from that. We've made great progress, but I think also using language that describes the situation and how it impacts. I'll give one line out of the report that affected this individual. and I'm just going to call the individual Sarah for lack of a better name. But the actual line in the note was, Sarah experiences some challenges with attention, but demonstrates many strengths. That was part of the assessment statement. What are some challenges? We have some challenges, but many strengths. That sounds good. But when you're trying to determine, is this person able to maintain employment or whatever? As an aside, I did call this clinician and just kind of said, hey, like, I just want you to know, like, this is kind of what's going on. And unfortunately, this person's, paying for an evaluation to try to appeal the decision. And we talked a little bit about language, and I kind of said, doing something, yes, we can talk about. Sarah has many strengths related to how she socializes with individuals and communicates her interests. However, she shows significant, clinically significant attention deficits that impair her ability to complete tasks, to independent work production, and to academically perform across settings. Again, accurate. So again, just some wording things.
And, I think we as clinicians need to be cautious about when we like a client, and almost if there can almost be this experience of like during our documentation, how, if we like the client or not, really, I think needs to take a backseat to that accuracy of information, because if it becomes like, I don't want to be mean. And again, it's not mean, but because like some of these terms are being brought in, like, going from like the clinical term idiot to now it's an insult. Certain language, we might then be like, oh, well, like, but, or even if I'm thinking of some of the sessions, like, did it really, really well. That doesn't mean impairments aren't present. It's just they were effective in that session.
Right. Absolutely. That's important to document. Yes. You need to document.
And the way we document that doesn't mean that there's the absence of any impairments, unless that is truly accurate. But letting there be both. And I'm reminded of, it was our podcast episode with Dr. Jobs, or David Jobs, on the CAMS model of surrounding suicidality. And part of his assessment was, what are the reasons for living and what are the reasons for dying? And kind of in the conversation, I remember him sharing, he's like, if we increase the reasons for living, that doesn't decrease suicidality. It's only when we start to decrease the reasons for dying. And really, when you're talking about the strengths as well as the functional impairment, like that's kind of the both. It's like, we want to increase the strengths, but it's really in our ability to decrease the impairments or decrease the impact of the impairments, or improving a capacity of coping or adapting to them. That's going to be what reduces impairment or improves living quality of life.
Yeah, it's so for me, I mean, kind of bouncing off that, I write using a kind of a 4-part formula for myself. Like, so when I write, I describe the strength, I describe the difficulty, so what's not working, I describe the impact, what is the person telling me their lived experiences with these challenges, and then I describe the path forward. Like, so when I'm in my notes, in my assessment, like the assessment part of my therapy notes, as well as if I'm writing a psychological report, those are what I think of. And I'll just kind of give a wording. And this is actually, I just kind of pulled it the other day because I was working with a kid about reading, doing an evaluation. And the report from the school said, Michael is struggling with reading. That is literally the quote. And in my report, I wrote, Michael demonstrates strong verbal comprehension and curiosity. However, significant deficits in phonological processing interfere with the accurate and fluency of his reading. These difficulties affect classroom performance and independent learning. With intensive structured literacy intervention and appropriate accommodations, meaningful progress would be expected. Real different. And so, yeah, I guess my thought for listeners is like, think about that as we're writing. Like when we're putting in our notes, when Michael's mom read this, she's like, that's exactly what's happening. We knew he was struggling reading. Like we knew that, but describing that impact and what's causing it, that was kind of the key. So,
And, I think when we can capture elements of that, like, well, and I don't know that, again, it doesn't need to be a novel, but it needs to be more than a few words. And it also needs to be more than, just a generalization. Like, we in the mental health profession are professionals, we're specialists. And so making sure that when our clients are walking away, they're feeling that they've gotten that input from someone with a deeper understanding and isn't just a, either blanket statement of, yeah, no, like you were tortured, nor do we want that to be,
right.
struggling with reading or, Sarah's experience with struggling with focus, but having a lot of strengths. We need to go a little bit deeper. And I know documentation, in my opinion, is the worst part of this profession. And, I don't think that that's necessarily an uncommon perspective, but it's a part for a reason. And so how do we make sure that we're giving it that level of care as well?
Yeah. Yeah. And when I do trainings about report writing, one of the quotes that I say often and is on one of my slides is that if we rate hope without honesty, all we're doing is providing reassurance. If hope with honesty, we will start providing intervention and support. So it's, the strengths are the hope, but the honesty is what really is the impact that we're seeing. Again, we can make it sound positive, but we don't want it to minimize the difference.
Very well said. With that, we hope you enjoy this episode. We'll be back in 2 weeks. But until then, be well, stay psyched.